Hello, I'm Tim Von Gall, CEO of Intersect Art and Design, and I'd like to welcome you to Intersect Chicago, the future of SOFA. Today is Veterans Day, and so we'd also like to send our thanks and appreciation to all of our veterans who have served, and once again, greatly appreciate them and their sacrifices. Today at Intersect Chicago, it is also our Fiber Arts Day. So we celebrate the fiber arts, and we're extremely pleased to be hosting this presentation by the studio Art Quilt Associates, also known throughout the art world as SAQA. SAQA is a nonprofit organization that works to bring art quilts to the forefront of the contemporary art world. During our program, please feel free to send in any questions you may have through the chat function on your Zoom screen. And to get this program underway, I am pleased to introduce the Executive Director of SAQA, Martha Sielman. Martha?
Thanks, Tim. I'm the Executive Director of Studio Art Quilt Associates, and we go by our acronym SAQA or SAQA. We are absolutely thrilled to be a cultural partner for the Intersect Chicago presentation. This has been something that we've dreamed of for many years, and we finally have the opportunity to share with you the kind of work that the artists in our organization create. I'm often asked, what is an art quilt? And just like art glass is based a long time ago on glass that is used every day for drinking and so on, and vases and so on and so forth, art quilts are also based on a traditional craft form, the kind that you put on your bed, but are taking that traditional form of layers and stitching and creating art with it. Ashlyn, could you start the PowerPoint, please? So SAQA has an extensive website, and if after today's presentation you would like to learn more about art quilts, we invite you to visit our website, saqa.com, where we have probably more than 3,500 pieces of art available for your viewing pleasure, along with a lot of other resources. SAQA is a membership organization. We have over 3,700 members in about 39 countries around the world, although about 80% of them are here in the United States. In addition to providing resources through our website, we also offer a variety of publications and exhibitions and conferences and so on. If you would like to find us on the Intersect Chicago website, and this screenshot is now a little bit out of date, on the homepage of the Intersect Chicago website, there's now a special box around where it says About on the screen that now says Cultural Partners. Next slide, please. Clicking on that link gives you a listing. Right now it's organized by type of art, and we're under fiber, and you'll find our logo, the SAQA logo. Next slide, please. On our page in the Intersect Chicago website, there are a lot of different resources. There are some video interviews that we did in 3 of the artists' studios. There are then 20 artworks by artists who were selected by a juror, Jane Sauer, who's a noted gallerist. And then there are other videos and other types of information about our organization as you scroll down that page. I hope that you'll have the opportunity to look and see some of the fun resources that we have put up on our page for you to enjoy. Today, I have the pleasure of sharing with you more information and more art by 3 of those artists, Marie Bergstedt, Linda Colsh, and Mita Giacomini. They're going to share their art, a little bit about how they create it, a little bit about how they work, and then we'll have the opportunity to ask them questions after their presentations. Please post questions as you think of them in the chat. I will be monitoring what you're typing there during the presentations. And then after Mita's presentation is concluded, I will then ask your questions of the 3 artists. Now, Ashlyn, next slide, please. Oh, sorry, this is just one more of SAQA. Now, I would like to introduce Marie Bergstedt, the first of our 3 artists.
Hello, I'm Marie Bergstedt, and I work out of San Francisco, but I grew up in Michigan, and I lived in the Chicago area for 14 years after that. And so I've been familiar with SOFA for a long time. I'm very grateful to SOFA and to SAQA for inviting me to do this. Ever since I was that little girl growing up in Michigan, I would look around me and see things that didn't seem quite so good to me. And I was always looking for some place or some way to produce something with more hope. So then when I started doing fiber work, I started telling stories that were related to those things. So I did series about health, aging, child abuse, mental states, women's rights, border issues. And in this first piece, next, gun violence. I've always found a person among my close relatives or my friends who experienced or had some connection to something that was going on that was bothering me. And so I work through their stories. And as I work with my hands, I almost always start out with something sad, but I try to come to a place where it can be a more positive statement or maybe some hope. In the end, I hope my work invites viewers to find their own story and understanding of the issue and broaden their view. Next. Emerson was my grandfather. He met his death by gunshot in Chicago in 1930. Like those of today, his death was surrounded in mystery. There was a newspaper report, there were police reports, coroner's report, and hearsay. But it all turned out that nobody really knew what happened. It was a mystery. And now, even today, with so many videos and numerous witnesses and all kinds of reports from this way and that way, everything seems to be, in the end, it's not resolved. And that's how I feel about this subject. Next. This is another image of my grandfather, and I put this one in so that you could see how my scale often is. I almost always do things larger than life. I think this is because I think the things that I deal with and the problems that I think about are bigger than I can really portray. And so I do that. And this piece is titled Shade. And I think it's because my grandfather probably was a bit of a shady character. Next. When I was first doing my artwork, lots of consultants told me that I was a feminist. And at that time, what I was doing, I didn't feel was feminist. But maybe they saw something in me that I didn't see about myself at the time. Because over time, obviously, my artwork has become more feminist. This is my great aunt Thelma. She was a bassist and a band director during the 1920s in Chicago. And she led all-male jazz bands. Jazz bands were really the thing. Then they traveled all over the country. They had bookings in Europe before the Second World War. But she met that ceiling that many women meet in their careers. She just couldn't deal with how hard it was to be a woman in a man's world. And she finally ended up firing all of the people in her band and running away. I hope that not all listen to that, but lots of things happened in the 20s, though, that were good for women, and they made progress, like getting the right to vote. Next. When I was in high school, I concentrated in the science and math, And I thought that I would go on to college and that's what I'd stick with, but I did not. And I don't know the particular reason why I didn't do it, but it seemed impractical to me. So this piece, what I did is it called Fit, is that girls and women are fit to be in the sciences. And I hope that this teacher will inspire girls to go on and follow the field of science if that's what they really want to do. I departed from buttons in this one and used squares of felt because it made more pixelized communication, which is more current. Next. I stayed on the subject of science a lot in 2018. I wanted to know more myself about women scientists and what they had accomplished. And I also wanted, if I learned anything from that, maybe it could help others learn as well. So I did research all through the centuries, down to the Roman Empire and up to now, and all around the world. And I learned far more there than I ever expected. There were many women who, against all odds, became very accomplished in the sciences. And so I took many of those women's names, their places that they lived, the years they lived, the countries, and I embroidered them, which embroidery is considered often over the years as one of the lowliest female pursuits. So I hand embroidered on a dress, which I made very tall, so that it would be as tall as a man, and put these accomplishments on the dress, ladies in lab coats, and as well as some of the symbols of science at the top. For me, this is something that people can read the names, they can see the countries, and hopefully more people will be interested in women in the sciences. And I'm also so happy that this year, for the 2020 awards, in Nobel Awards, there were more women in the sciences. Next. An issue that's become more prominent during the COVID period is homelessness. But this is my brother, Mikey, and his friend, Thomas. They were, for many, many years, street musicians in Key West, Florida. And I lost contact with Mikey for about 35 years. And then he found me, actually. And I was very happy that the studios of Key West offered me an artist residency. And I went to Key West to learn more about my brother and his friends. And one of the interesting things that I found there is, though he had many friends who worked and had regular jobs and everything, but the people who eked out a living because they had a passion for something like music on the streets, they never fit into the box of life. And it took a lot of ingenuity to survive for years living this way. And so this is a memorial to Mikey and his friend Thomas, who both died recently. Next. Borders have been a serious issue, not just in our country, but across the world. And these concerns are prevalent everywhere. Now, in migration, whether it's because you're having to leave a country because of the pain and misery that you have there, or the problems, or even if it's just a happy migration to another country, it's really fraught with lots of stress. And so the last two images that I'm showing are about what happens kind of with these issues across borders. And one of the things that I've found, both in the people that I know and in families and such, is that there's something that goes across borders, and that's love. I've traveled a lot, and I found wonderful friends in every country I've gone. And I know many people who stretch across the border between Mexico and the United States, which this line is, you might recognize the Texas-Mexico borderline here. That love goes across just like butterflies and seeds blow across, and there can be some happiness across borders. Next. And my final one is about family separation. The model for this particular piece is a naturalized US citizen who grew up in Mexico. He is a father, a musician, and a well-educated management worker. And I did this piece and I asked him, because I was thinking about family separation, if I could have two of the girls dance off the corner up at the right side. And he thought about it for a week. And he could not bear the idea of separation, even a suggestion in something that he just happened to have an image on a piece of artwork that wasn't necessarily about him, but more of a broader concept. And so I end with the heartbeat of family is the most important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marie. Ashlyn, can you go to the next slide? And I'd like to introduce Linda Colsh.
Hi, I'm Linda Colsh, and by way of introduction, I lived overseas for about a third of my life, mostly in Europe, but also in Korea. Next slide, please. This is the first piece that really was where I introduced people into my work. This woman, I was traveling in Berlin and photographing some above ground pipes. They're color-coded pipes that I found very interesting. And into my camera frame walked this little old woman with her stick. And I, of course, took her picture too. And when I got home, I found myself thinking about her, and I was very glad I had her image. So I started to work with her image in Photoshop and eventually made silk screens of the images I had of her. And this is the very first piece where she appeared. Next slide, please. This is from a couple of years later, and by that time I realized that I was going to start collecting images of people because I found I was fascinated with primarily the elderly and creatives who work with their hands. At this point, I was telling a visual story with what I call props, which is all the little bits and pieces that go to make up this woman's story. She was going into a porte cochere and unlocking the door, and I imagined all the wonderful things that she had in her collection behind the porte cochere. Next, please. At one point, I decided that I wanted to try telling a story with just the figure, but several poses of the figure. And this is a woman I found in Brussels. I was able to get off 3 shots of her before she disappeared down an alleyway. I was fascinated by her. My eye caught her initially because she was in a thin red sweater. When I looked at her a little further, I realized she was in bedroom slippers, and it was the middle of winter. The cobbles were icy, and I thought, what was it that was on her mind that got her so within herself that she disregarded where she was? Next, please. This is one of my 3D installation pieces. This one is called Wearing Silence. I have a series of these that are about migration and migrants, about people who move. And this actually is a 3D installation, and these pieces will move in air currents, and they hide and reveal the sides of the individual pieces. I chose to use used coffee filters for this giant mobile because I felt like coffee was a sort of a social icebreaker kind of a beverage. And I also thought of the filter as being a good metaphor for migrants who move into, through, and then out again of societies, cultures, and even bureaucracy. Next, please. This piece does not actually have people on it, but it's about people, as all my work is about people. This is a piece where I've used old walls, and I always write about my people who I have collected in notebooks, and I write about them. I keep a thumbnail of every one of them. And I realized at one point that my notebooks were kind of like a history or an anthology. And it wasn't a far leap to think of all the marks that are on walls, and whether they're made by humans or erosion or whatever, as a sort of history also. I feel like walls can they can shout with graffiti or advertising. As the advertising peels away, you start getting mixed messages. And as the old walls get moldy and start to deteriorate, they aren't like old people, and they can even fall as old people fall. Next, please. This one I call Page Turner. It's about paper. And ephemera is those pieces of paper where we've made marks. It's not unlike the walls in that there are marks that we leave as something tangible for those that come behind us. I also, I like to think of leaving things behind us. Because I've lived in so many places, I like to leave things for, like, as I call it, leaving them for the archaeologists. I have left little bits of our lives every place we've lived. We actually did live in an old farmhouse in Belgium for a while, and we had a midden. And I have often thought about that midden, and I would throw pins and old thimbles and little bits and pieces of our lives. I even threw a piece of Korean pottery in there because we had lived in Korea before. And I like to think of what the archaeologists will posit someday when they dig that up and find a piece of Korea there in a little village in Belgium. Next, please. This one is Par Hazard, which means chance. It's about the game of rock, paper, and scissors, which is a selection game. And the game, almost all children know it because you hide your hand and then you reveal a hand signal for whether you're indicating rock or paper or scissors. Again, there are some of my my coffee filters, my used coffee filters. They're printed with scissor images. Actually, they're all my scissors. And then the back side of this, or the inside of this, is outlines of stones that I've collected from our creeks here in Maryland. Next, please. These are a couple of studio shots. The one on the left is me painting with the head of a zinnia and doing gestural work that reminds me of studying Oriental calligraphy, which I did when we lived in Korea. And the other side shows you the state of my studio. Next, please. This is a little piece that will go into one of my next two quilts, but this I wanted to show you a close-up of how I actually do my screen printing. I make several screens of each person, and then I layer them in different orders and repeat them across in this case, a patch. Sometimes it's across a whole surface of a quilt. Next, please. This one is very simple. These are, again, the outlines of some of the creek stones that I've collected from our creeks here. When we moved to Maryland, after having lived in Europe and Asia for so long, I realized that I was moving from a place where I was experiencing mostly urban, noisy, highly populated urban environments, and now we live in the country, quite far out, and I go days without seeing people. I'm walking along creeks and in the forests, and it's very quiet out here. And sometimes when I feel my work is getting too busy and too complicated, which sometimes happens for patchworkers, I go to something very, very simple, very minimal. Next, please. This is the piece that's actually in Intersect Chicago, and this piece, like the piece before it, is a scroll, a standing scroll. This was the first one. Next, please. It can be shown in a single scroll or a double scroll or tightly wrapped or loosely wrapped. This, I think of this as like a cabinet of curiosities for collectors, because a cabinet of curiosity, again, depends on hiding and revealing. My collections here are on the outside, it's people, my collected people from urban streets, and on the inside are numbers. I also like to collect numbers. So often we are reduced to being just a number, our passport number, our driver's license, our phone number, whatever. Next, please. And this is to close, I'd like to close with a little detail from this. It shows two of my favorite characters. The woman is la flâneuse, which is someone who wanders the streets just observing, which I found was what I was doing. And of course, the artist, I found him by the turtle fountain in Rome. And he looked up and I showed him my camera. I pointed him my camera and he winked and said, okay. And he went back to his drawing. And I found that was charming. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Ashley, thank you. Now we're going to hear from Mita Giacomini.
Hello, everybody. I am talking to you from Dundas, Ontario in Canada. I moved here 26 years ago, thinking I would stay for a couple of years, and here I still am. I was originally from Northern California, the San Francisco Bay Area, and came here for a job. So I'm going to start by sharing some pieces from my series called Other Words for Birds. And then I'll talk a bit about how surface weaving works, the technique, and close on some thoughts about why fiber is a unique and compelling medium for making images. So next slide, please. So the concept behind this series is to contemplate a personal encounter with a bird and to appreciate the bird as a unique individual. In a way, I consider these kind of portraits of experiences as much as birds. And this contrasts with a common bird watching habit, often including my own habit of identifying a bird's species and then just moving on, and things like collecting life lists of species, and it can get quite competitive and quite compulsive. It's also a bit of a departure from the traditional sort of ornithological art that concentrates on species features and stereotypical poses. I sort of vary from that as a great deal in these pieces. And in the spirit of treating birds as individuals, I'll tell you the collector of this piece told me that she's renamed it Gertrude and Oscar, which I find quite charming. Next slide, please. So here's a detail of that, of Gertrude or Oscar. I'm actually not sure which is which. This shows how surface weaving looks close up and the kinds of marks it makes. You can see that it's very densely stitched and woven. And unlike conventional weavings, the marks can kind of go madly off in all directions, or they can also follow very deliberate paths, and you'll see both those things here. And in this way, the process of surface weaving, for me, it feels a lot more like drawing or painting than, say, loom or tapestry weaving, where you're going one line at a time, almost in a pixelated way up the piece. Next slide, please. It's a pretty strenuous mental practice not to think of birds foremost in terms of their species. And it tends to slide me to the other extreme, which is anthropomorphizing birds, which has its own issues conceptually, but I resist it less. As I work, the bird kind of becomes more familiar and also more mysterious at the same time to me. And weaving these images feels like a kind of a creature to creature I thou meditation in a way. And I tend to fall in love with the birds I weave. And I'll confess with this one in particular, it's a turkey vulture. Next slide, please. I put as much care into the ground of these pieces as into the figures, and I want them to convey a feeling of um, more of a feeling than a sense of place, but also a sense of place. So play with that balance, and also with the balance between seeing the textile itself and seeing the represented image through the textile. So this was an enjoyable challenge with this one, going for that sort of airiness and brightness of the sky, but also clearly making stitches that have, recognizable strands of fabric and string and yarn. Next slide, please. Here's a different sense of surroundings in this piece, down on the ground rather than up in the air. And you can see how birds don't always respond to me with a long, soulful gaze into the eyes. Being ignored or fled is definitely part of the experience of hanging out with birds. Next slide, please. So this piece is in a traveling SAQA exhibit called Color with a U. It's currently at St. Francis Xavier University in Antigonish for anyone who's tuning in from Nova Scotia. Some people say that my pieces remind them of neo-impressionist or pointillist style paintings. And this piece plays with that sort of color, that optical color mixing effect of those painting styles. So from a distance, it looks like a palette of cool grays, white and black. But up close, you'll see that it's really zillions of marks of very rich and saturated colors from all over the color wheel. And that's part of why it's called color theories. Next slide, please. So here's the technique. I came up with a surface weaving technique myself, and I always get a lot of questions about how these pieces are made. So I'll walk you through the basic steps here. Reading left to right. First, I get some color blocking down on a base fabric. There are various ways of doing this. And for this demo, I've just put a purple silk circle on top of a yellow cotton background to make it very clear. I then stitch loosely all over the fabric, but usually by machine, but sometimes by hand in certain spots or even for certain pieces. And the next step in the middle is the weaving part, and it's hand weaving all sorts of yarns and strings and strips of fabric among those base stitches. And so the name surface weaving refers to the fact that at this stage, the strands don't need to go all the way through that base fabric the way, for example, embroidery would. And for that reason, I can work with much thicker or strangely shaped or textured yarns and even strips of fabric than I would be able to use if I were actually trying to push a needle through a fabric. And so this goes on, this middle stage goes on and on and on and on and on and on, sometimes for many days or even months, until the weaving has pretty much obscured the base fabric underneath. And I finish the pieces with free motion quilting to backing layers. And this adds more texture and body and stability to the pieces. Next slide, please. Here's a sample of the many sorts of strands that I weave with. I use mostly silk, wool, and cotton, and I'm always on the lookout for designer silks and silk scarves and things people don't want. They're really hideous because when they're cut into strips, they look pretty darn good. So if you have a stash of these, think of me. And if you multiply these bunches by several hundred and then toss them in the air and let them fall on any available surface, you will get exactly what my studio looks like on any random day. That's as close as you're going to get to a picture of my studio in this talk. Next slide, please. So this piece, Glimmer, this is my piece in SAQA's viewing room here at Intersect Chicago. And I'll give you a closer look at it since you won't be able to visit it in person. And I hope to show you why, despite the comparisons, I think fiber really isn't like paint in pretty aesthetically important ways, and why I prefer making images with fiber. Next slide, please. So that little black square in the top middle, I picked sort of randomly. It's a pretty unexciting half-inch square bit of the image, and it's the ground near the bird. And I've zoomed in on it on the lower left. And at this level of detail, you can see a whole little abstract composition, and the piece becomes more three-dimensional. And this 15 by 15 inch square piece contains many hundreds of these sort of half-inch vignettes. These give viewers a lot more than the bird to see, and I hope something new to notice each time they look at the piece. And importantly, this is the level at which I do most of the work. thinking about the quality of the strands, the tensions between them, the color interactions, the shadows, the reflected colors, and how all of these work together to make the marks as I go along. So while this technique does take a lot of time, and that's probably another very common comment I get about it is, isn't this time consuming? And it is, and I'm not so sure it's more time consuming than other types of art, but at any rate, it does take a lot of time, but it's not at all tedious. I'm constantly making choices and decisions as I go along to make these little snippets. And up close here, you can see the texture, of course, but I think there's something more profound that comes across, and that's the knowledge that there's complexity at every scale of the image. Next slide, please. So complexity over a great range of scales is an important geometric quality of nature. If the picture looks really tiny, it's supposed to look that way at this point. Don't adjust your screen. If you consider the beauty of a tree and how an aerial view of the forest and the tree and one of its leaves and a microscopic view of the leaf cells are all equally complex when you really look, you kind of, we go through nature knowing that it presents us always with worlds within worlds, and that's part of its fascination, really, and also its familiarity to us. We recognize that in nature. And I think something analogous is going on with surface weavings and also with a lot of other fiber artworks. And you might think about this when you look at other work in this show and in others. Here's how it works with this piece, this complexity at different scales. This teeny little picture is what you'd see if you just walked into the room and saw the piece across the room. And you can see there's, it's interesting color and composition, and a little bit comes through. And this is kind of like that aerial view of the forest. Next slide, please. So as you move closer and you're standing in front of it, you can see some new details, and you experience some vibrance from the optical color mixing that I talked about earlier. Next slide. And here's the little 1/2-inch square that I showed you before. And I said this at this scale, a little closer, maybe maybe how a fly buzzing by would see it. The image becomes abstract, and there's a whole new sculptural aspect and different color interactions that come into view. Next slide, please. So finally, here at the bottom, these are 3 different microscopic views of areas in the piece that are roughly about 1/8 of a square inch a piece in size. And there are many thousands of these, of course, in this artwork. And at this level, it's interesting things start to happen. You see that there are unexpected colors, like there's red and there's a turquoise that you really don't see from across the room or in front of the piece, or even kind of looking closely. And you get much more dramatic new forms and entirely new compositions. It's just like a sort of abstract sculpture almost. And so on this slide, having all these views together, I want you to sort of notice how aesthetically these micro views are just as complex, and they're just as compelling as anything you'd see on the top row looking at the piece as a whole. And I find that really exciting about fiber. And I believe we experience fiber art at this bottom, this microscopic level, in 2 ways. The first is by seeing, of course, because if we have good vision, or in my case, I would need a magnifying glass or a microscope to see what's on the bottom there. And of course, there's that. But the second way we experience this micro level when we see a fiber artwork is by knowing. Everyone has intimate experiential knowledge of the structure of fiber and textiles. And while we may not entirely see the details of the weave of the fabric strips or the twists of the yarn, we know they're there. And so they're still part of our experience of the artwork. And I think this resonates with the way that we experience the natural world, which we also know has this kind of endless divisibility. You can keep looking closer and always keep seeing new things, new worlds, worlds within worlds open up. And that's the same kind of, it's a visceral feeling you might feel when you're looking at a forest full of trees or a tree full of leaves and so forth. So anyway, when artworks offer visual complexity across this range of scales like this, I believe they can give viewers this kind of deep and ineffable or intuitive experience of liveliness and of presence. and this comes really naturally working with fiber as a medium, but I think it's probably harder to achieve with a medium like paint. It's something you may also notice in other media that have very, complex compositions. So anyway, I find this very, very magical about working with fiber as an artistic medium, and very exciting to work with. And I will leave it there. Thank you for listening. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and your questions.
Thank you, Mita. Ashlyn, can you turn off the PowerPoint? And if Marie and Linda, there we are. So we got a lot of feedback, a lot of good questions from the audience. And I'm going to just go around the group and ask some of the questions that came in. Marie, obviously, several of the pieces, most of the pieces that you shared with us were absolutely covered with buttons. But I did get a couple of questions about what are some of the other media that you use in your art besides buttons?
Almost all of my artwork has embroidery. I do a lot of embroidery, and sometimes not even with buttons. I almost always have crochet and knitting on them also. So the buttons are, I showed you things that kind of are primarily buttons, but I don't necessarily always do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I have a quick follow-up that's my own question is, the buttons are heavy, even plastic buttons are heavy. How do you create something, especially in those larger scale pieces, that can support all that weight?
It's difficult. I have to think about the weight of them and how to support them way before I get very far. And some of them will have to be shipped a lot. So I also have to think about where could they fold. And so I make places where they can fold that you can't tell. But a lot of them have a strip of twill tape that runs and is attached all the way up. And then it has like D hangers on the top.
Sure.
And a few of them have some kind of metal support across the shoulder, say, because they don't have a box to be in, they have to be supported more than just in one place. So sometimes I put a bar across.
Okay, no, that makes tremendous sense. Linda, the question that I wanted to share with you to start with was with the pieces that are in the scroll format. One is a technical question. How do you stiffen it so that it is moldable and it stands up? But then secondly, what is the meaning for you of that scroll format as opposed to a piece that would be on the wall or your hanging mobiles?
The technical question first. It's stiffened by a special batting that is called, or filler that is called Peltex. I use Peltex. Mm-hmm. I've also used Timtex. And so and the front and back are either paper or fabric.
And why a scroll format?
Early on in my life, I was a writer. That was my first job. Well, no, I was a waitress first, but we that. No, I was a writer for about 10 years before I married into the military and started moving. And I became an observer and a recorder. And for me, books are that important because they record histories, they record stories and observations. And the scroll form is actually older than what we think of as a book, which is a codex. So I felt like a scroll was a good way to present a number of people, or in the case of my first one, a collection.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then Mita, there's a sort of process question for you, which is, do you work on the background first, the figure first, or do you work on them simultaneously?
That's a great question. I work on, well, it depends on what you mean by work. Most of these pieces involve a lot of preliminary sketches. So many, and a lot of time put into that. And there I focus a lot on the figure, the bird itself, if it's a bird. I have some more sort of atmospheric pieces that are a little different that way. And there isn't that distinction between figure and ground. But once I start weaving, one of the things about this method is that you don't have to, but I do weave over the whole piece at the same time. It's very sort of holographic, almost the way the image sort of starts coming into focus for me. So I work on both. I think that definitely the bird, the figure drives what the ground will be like. So I mess with the ground a lot more to accommodate the figure at the end. But nice question, yeah.
Yeah, people really were fascinated by just the number of different colors and weights and textures of fibers that you were combining in your work. Marie, let's continue that question over to you of, do you draw out what you're going to do first, or does it sort of evolve as you're working on it?
I use a lot of photography because I used to be a photography major in art school.
Okay.
So, but I don't do it exactly like the photograph. I usually cut them up and make a collage that might be more like what I'm trying to do. And then I draw that, which sometimes is way huge more than what my little collages. But I change. I'm working on one now that I have moved things around. I made parts and I keep moving them around, and almost nothing comes out exactly the way I start. So I change a lot.
I think we can all relate to that. Linda, the same question really for you is, do you start with a drawing of what you're trying to do? Do you start with the backgrounds? How does the composition develop?
Probably from one of two directions. One is because I'm a patchworker. I may be going into my piles of printed characters because they're like the picture I showed of the shepherd. I have a lot of pieces around with people printed on them. And then occasionally I will just start composing on my design wall with all the patches. And then the other thing I do is I also paint what I call big strokes. And I go out in my driveway and I paint with a broom or a great big brush. And again, this relates back to when I was studying calligraphy. I no longer know the characters that I was writing with the calligraphy, but there's a kind of muscle memory that comes with doing calligraphy, and I'm doing it on a great big scale. So it's usually either one of those two, either a big scale painted piece or patchworking.
Mm-hmm. And we've talked about this before, but a lot of your work has a very muted palette. There's an awful lot of pieces that are white and gray and black. And you talk about your palette and why you keep being drawn back to that very monotone, minimalist kind of palette compared to, say, Mita's work, which is as many colors as she can possibly fit in.
I think it's because when I'm composing, I basically think in value. And value contrasts from the darkest darks to the lightest lights give me a lot of possibilities for composing and designing a piece. I also, when I'm printing, I think in value. I like to start with a new sort of a medium value background and then print lighter and darker on that background. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's a question of value. And I found because my work in the 90s was brightly colored. And when I gave that up, I started thinking of color as sort of like a piece of jewelry or a scarf or an adornment or something that I could throw in there on occasion just for a little pop. But for the most part, I like to work with the neutrals.
Mm-hmm. Mita, you talked earlier about optical mixing. Can you explain a little bit what that is and how it affects the colors that you choose?
Sure. So optical mixing is the basic idea is, if you're a painter and you want to make a green, you can take some blue paint and some yellow paint and mix them together and you'll have green paint. And the neo-impressionists or the pointillists started painting in a way such that you would not mix those paints together. You'd put a little dab of blue and a little dab of yellow, and you'd have a lot of those little dabs. And what happens is optically, your eye will mix those into green if you stand at a certain distance from the piece. What's interesting, fun fact about this is those painters learned this theory from a chemist working in the textile industry, trying to understand how woven threads, if you have a green weft and a blue weft and a yellow warp, together they make kind of a green fabric. So this is where painters actually learned something interesting from the textile arts. But a lot of different things happen. One is if you throw the whole kitchen sink in there, as I've given the impression I do, which I could do, and then you'd end up with it I could make something that way that from a far enough distance might look as neutral as Linda's work, but you have to probably get way, way back to make it all go gray. You mix a lot of colors together. And the other thing that happens is as you're looking at it, you don't see just green, you see green, you see the blue a little bit, the yellow, because your eye is always moving and you're moving, and you see, because of your eye moving, you see their complements. So it's kind of an odd, it does something, I don't, now it gets mystical for me. I'm not a physicist or an optician or anybody with expertise in this area, but it creates a kind of a vibrating sense in your perception that also enlivens things. So that's why you wouldn't want to do the easy thing and just make green paint.
Or just use green fabrics, yarns.
Right. Yeah, we're not painting. Yeah.
Marie, this question maybe is most for you, although it's addressed to all three artists. Your subject matter tends to be about things that people sometimes find very uncomfortable. Do you feel that the subject matter you choose makes it more difficult for you to find places to exhibit your work and people who are willing to collect your work?
I don't think it's particularly difficult for places to show it, because a lot of art places, I've actually been told by curators, they like something that's a little edgy. But buying it and having it in their home is another matter. However, someone bought one of the ones that I did with my brother Mikey that was definitely a street person, and it's a big one, so you can't tell. But I do think it's easier to sell things that are not edgy.
And Linda, some of your work also has that quality to it, especially with the emphasis on maybe more about aging and isolation and being separate from the rest of society, which a lot of your figures seem to convey. Do you find that makes it difficult for people to look at? Does it make them feel uncomfortable?
I think my subject matter is probably not quite as difficult for people to identify with, because they all look at it and say, oh, that's my grandmother, or that's my grandfather. So it's relatable, but I don't know if it's cultural or why, but you're right in that people don't really want it hanging on their walls. They like to look at it in shows and galleries, but they don't necessarily want to live with it. Although I have to say the first piece I showed was sold. It's now living in a fantastic historic house in Switzerland. And the man and woman who bought it, it was because they related to it as their own family.
Oh, that's nice. And then Mita, I think I'm going to give you the last question, which is when you're talking about your birds, you said that as you work on them, they become more familiar, but also more mysterious. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that tension between trying to portray a recognizable bird, but also to do something more with it than simply identifying, oh, that's an ostrich.
Yeah. Well, you've actually summed it up nicely, but yeah, I mean, I think this happens to people even just with bird watching, even if you're not making art. You start paying attention to these creatures, and they are so interesting, and they are so mysterious. There's a great deal we don't really know about what their songs mean or how they live, where we don't know. I love turkey vultures. I've confessed this, and every time anybody asks me about this, is I end up talking about my feelings about turkey vultures. I don't know what happened to me. But anyway, we don't know where they go in the winter. We don't know where they go. And I was shocked to learn that. They seem so common and so ordinary. So there's that. And there's also the mystery of the way they they live like right on top of us and integrated into our lives. And yet they have completely separate worlds. And so the birds in my backyard, I feel very attached to it, and they seem very familiar, but they're also just, I really don't know half the time what they're up to. And I'm always running to catch up. But I think bird watching is also like that for people. They start paying attention to one and suddenly it just never ends, the things you can discover. So
Yeah, I'm a big bird watching fan too. I
okay.
just read a fascinating book called The Genius of Birds about a lot of the current research being done into bird behavior.
Yeah.
So if you like birds, look for The Genius of Birds. But now we're out of time. I would like to thank the Intersect Art and Design staff so much for welcoming us into their Intersect Chicago presentation. I want to thank Ashlyn for doing a great job with our slides. I want to thank Tim for introducing us and getting us practiced so we could do this. If you would like to see more art, please go to our page in the Cultural Partners section of the Intersect Chicago website, and that will also then link you back to the SAQA.com website, where we have thousands of other artwork for you to enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martha, and thank you all. Really, what an extraordinary presentation. The engagement, the questions, the interest has been overwhelming. So really, you're wonderful to do this, and we greatly appreciate it. And I echo the same thing. Please make sure to our visitors, please go onto the website, go onto the cultural partner page, and there are great resources that can get you to the SAQA website. And so many of the questions that may not have been answered here, which I can see in the chat, are so many. I'm sure we can both make great efforts to try to distribute those, get those questions answered for you correctly. So once again, thank you, and have a wonderful day, and greatly appreciate it. And I hope everybody enjoys the fair.
Yeah, thank you.
Take care. Bye now.
Bye-bye.